You might have noticed that my last few reviews have been about fairly light subject matter, that I've been focusing on guilty pleasures, let's call them. Well, that can only mean one thing. It's now time to tackle a Tarkovsky film. For those who didn't watch my review of Solaris, just know that Andrei Tarkovsky isn't for casual moviegoers. His work will strain your attention span if you don't overanalyze every methodical frame, and it's all designed to be far more artistic than it is entertaining. Now, I got a lot of comments on my Solaris video from people disagreeing with my interpretation of the film, which is fine, I welcome discussion. So I want to stress that I'm just a guy on the internet, sharing his 2 cents in the hope of getting 4 cents in return. I'm not a lifelong academic or a hoity-toity film professor. Sure, I went to film school, but I hardly think that makes me any kind of authority, especially not on someone as sophisticated as Tarkovsky. Nevertheless, today I'm going to tackle Stalker, which is on my list of top 5 greatest films of all time. Because there's so much to analyze and discuss, though, I'm going to do things a little differently today, a little more YouTube-ly. Instead of going by my usual structure, I'm going to cover the movie chronologically. Not really shot for shot, though I probably could given that the film only has 142 shots, but certainly in order, and I'll sprinkle in my usual production history, trivia, and personal opinion throughout. This video will make a heck of a lot more sense if you've actually seen Stalker, but if you don't want to watch it, and some of you definitely won't, then maybe just watch this video more than once, so it will all make sense. To be clear, for legal reasons, I must stress this video is not meant to be a market replacement for the film, but a companion piece made by a rando who would never try to compare his own work to Tarkovsky's. I'm also going to be relying on mostly still frames of the film, only showing you motion when it's important to what I'm saying. I know some of you will complain about that, but as I see it, this is the only way for me to adequately cover this film in particular without skating the line of fair use and getting massacred by copyright bots. So, with all of that out of the way, let's get started. Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker opens with a completely unnecessary opening narration scroll that I can't even read. It informs us of the basic backstory of what the Zone is, but dialogue later in the story will explain all of this anyway and in a more appropriately vague manner. I suspect this bit was mandated, put in against Tarkovsky's wishes, and that's probably the most negative thing I will say about this entire movie. Then we get to this inward tracking shot of a bed in a Spartan bedroom, a table on one end and a little pair of crutches against the wall on the other. Remember those, by the way. On the table is a bitten apple and a glass of water, which Tarkovsky fans will immediately clock as familiar imagery, alongside the most interesting objects for me, a used injection needle, some cotton, and a couple of pills. You could interpret this as being medication for Stalker's daughter, Monkey, given her infirmity, but another reading that I really like is that these are Stalker's drugs. Though it's not said outright, the implication throughout this movie is that the Zone is literally killing Stalker, either because it's causing him to suicidally turn to drugs for comfort, or because of the side effects of the Zone. As further evidence for this, Stalker is seen coughing from time to time throughout the film, though nobody ever really draws attention to it. Then the train comes in off-screen, and this is the first instance of a train motif placed throughout the entire film. The vibration of the train causes the glass to rattle and move across the table, a shot that will be referenced again at the end, but the most interesting thing is the sound of the train, at first jarring but slowly morphing into something more rhythmic and hypnotic. When it came to the music for Stalker, Andrei Tarkovsky didn't want a traditional movie score, so he went to Eduard Artemyev, who he'd worked with before on Solaris and Mirror, and told him that he wasn't looking for new musical compositions so much as he was looking for musical effects. The main theme, which you only hear a couple of times, was designed to be a blending of East and West, with medieval European musical themes played on traditionally Eastern instruments like the tar, with traditionally Eastern styles of improvisation. While most of the movie is without music, Artemyev did add to the soundtrack, and The Train is a subtle example of this, where he tinkered with the noises of the train to include almost subconscious intonations of classical music like Beethoven's Ode to Joy. There is a later example of how the train noise is used in a much less subtle way, but for now, let's get back to the bedroom. The camera pans very methodically over the bed's occupants, a woman whose eyes may or may not be closed, a little girl with a covered head who we learn is called Monkey, and then the titular Stalker, looking patiently at his family to see if they're really asleep. He then crawls out of bed, and if we pause here, you can see how almost every single shot is framed like a painting. Without getting into the nuances of mise en scène with you, the basic idea is that it's meant to feel not so much like a motion picture, but like a very carefully framed portrait that moves. When Tarkovsky screened the first finished cut of the movie to the officials at Goskino, they complained that this entire opening sequence was perhaps a bit slow. Tarkovsky, therefore, decided it would make sense to make it even slower, so as to disabuse audiences right away of any notion that this was anything but a serious work. And for casual audiences, that makes sense, because I predict that most people who aren't pompous film nerds like myself will indeed find this movie incredibly slow. And if you can't get through this opening sequence, it probably would be wise to stop watching it at this point. Keep watching this review though, it's not 3 hours long.
Не скрою, были случаи, когда людям приходилось возвращаться с полдороги несолоно хлебавши.
For me though, this movie is already absolutely enthralling, even though very little has happened and we're only 3 or 4 cuts into the thing. Tarkovsky is not for the impatient, but he is for those who like to tease out meaning and/or beauty from every deliberate choice on screen. In one long take, we see Stalker retrieve something from behind the headboard and slink through the open doorway, closing it partially behind him as he exits the shot. Then, for only a handful of frames, we see the woman, his wife, sit up in bed and look towards the camera, before we then cut to Stalker going about his morning routine of putting the kettle on and brushing his teeth. The wife comes in and asks why Stalker stole her watch, which is what he retrieved from the headboard, before berating him about having just gotten out of prison, barely knowing his daughter and how he promised he would stop being a stalker. And that raises the question, why did he steal her watch? It's not particularly relevant to the plot. We do see him checking the watch, but it could have easily just been his watch. Making it hers, in other words, is a deliberate choice. But to understand it, you have to realize that the watch is being used metaphorically. Stalker has to steal it because he's literally taking time away from his family. That's the kind of smooth narrative gag a lot of people won't even notice on anything but a subliminal level. Hey, editing Tug here. It occurs to me now that there are other reasons why the watch had to be the wife's. For one thing, it could be a simple misdirect. The narrative is leading you to believe Stalker is some kind of drug addict, so maybe you're supposed to think he's going to sell it for narcotics. A better explanation is to highlight something Stalker admits towards the end of the film, that he's so desperate and destitute that he has nothing to give to his family. Therefore, it's reasonable to assume that if he could afford a watch, he'd give it to her rather than keeping it for himself. So, anyway, back to Past Tug. After Stalker leaves, without much compassion for his poor wife, she falls to the floor in anguish and flails around in the misery of her existence, a shot that will be mirrored a little later when Stalker first gets to the zone. But holy cow, look at how long I've been talking and we're barely 10 minutes into a nearly 3-hour-long film. I'd better speed things along. But before we go any further, do you like sci-fi horror? Do you like books? Well, have I got the book for you. It's called The Caves of Solace, and it'll be available on August 4th, 2026 through Amazon. It's the story of people diving deep into the depths of an alien planet to solve a centuries-old mystery involving mass disappearances, ghosts, strange scientific anomalies, and a heavy dose of Lovecraftian madness. Through my links in the description, you can pre-order your digital copy now, you can order your physical copy on August 4th, or you can join my Patreon at the $8 level to secure your own signed copy. Again, that is the Caves of Solace, available August 4th. It's a hell of a journey. We next meet our second main character, Writer, as played by Tarkovsky regular Anatoly Solzhenitsyn. If you're confused by the names of the characters, that's because we only get archetypal nicknames, aside from the bartender Ruger for some reason. Anyway, it looks like Writer is trying to hit on a woman by talking about philosophy and religion. That always gets them to drop their undergarments, let me tell you. And it is made abundantly clear what kind of guy this is. He's a hipster nihilist who isn't just a skeptic but a full-blown cynic that would make H.L. Mencken depressed. After Stalker dismisses the woman without admitting that he is in fact a stalker, maybe avoiding a sting by the authorities, Stalker blames Writer's irresponsible behavior in public on drinking, though we'll later learn that Writer is always like this, even without alcohol. The two of them go into a bar to meet the third member of their little troupe, the Professor. He's called that, but he's pretty cagey about what he actually is, saying only that he is something of a scientist. Writer uses this as a launching point for one of his many navel-gazing soliloquies, where he talks about how the scientist's job is to dig into reality to find truth, whereas the writer, when he digs for truth, finds only excrement. He then talks about a piece of pottery at a museum that everyone thought was a priceless bit of antiquity but turned out to just be an errant trash can they had been unwittingly celebrating. And this gives away Writer's entire character arc. That piece of pottery he's talking about is how he personally sees the room at the center of the zone, through the cold eyes of a non-believer who rejects any supernatural value given to ordinary things. From this, we can predict exactly how he will behave when he gets there. We'll talk more about that later, but for now, it's just important that he says he is seeking the room because he wants inspiration. As soon as he walks out of the bar, Writer wants to turn back to buy some more cigarettes, but Professor stops him. We get the idea that there's a superstition about turning back, and lo and behold, this idea is an enormous motif in the film. Multiple times in the story, one character or another will turn back or consider turning back, and indeed, the entire plot of the movie is about these three men getting to the room and, spoiler alert, turning back without going inside. Jumping ahead a bit, we get to a car chase. But don't get too excited, it's Tarkovsky's interpretation of a car chase. The trio has gotten into a car and are using it to sneak into the zone, but in order to do that, they have to avoid a patrolling police officer. The geometry in the scene is nearly impossible to track, with one reverse shot that is particularly disorienting, and we get the sense that they have to wind their way around in order to reach their destination, which is something we'll see again when they're in the zone. When they follow a train through an armed military checkpoint, the film's budgetary problems first become apparent. You see, Tarkovsky spent about a year filming the movie on some experimental Kodak stock, but when he tried to have all of that developed, the entire thing was ruined in what may or may not have been deliberate sabotage by forces unseen. This was a devastating blow that should by all rights have killed the production, but Tarkovsky persevered, completely reworking the script while reconfiguring of the budget went on behind the scenes. Tarkovsky did have to fight with his co-writers, the brothers Arkady and Boris Strugatsky, who also wrote the book the movie is based on, Roadside Picnic, and by the time he was finished, the film was so far removed from its source material that they can be safely considered two completely different stories. Tarkovsky had changed the tone of the film by changing the character of Stalker from a pathetic con man to a tortured true believer, a change that is core to understanding the story. And then Tarkovsky had to start filming from scratch on a greatly reduced budget. In the initial version, the filmmaker had access to more props and more effects, but in the movie we got, it's obvious on screen that he was greatly constrained. So after crossing through the threshold of the zone, our trio gets to a small rail car and travels further in. The camera tracks them up close while the only sound we hear is the rhythmic sound of the car on the tracks. And this is probably how a lot of audience members look at this point. Over time, the thumping of the tracks gets augmented by ever stranger sounds to indicate that they are entering something more alien and unknown before, boom, we get our Wizard of Oz moment as the film switches from monochromatic sepia to full-bodied color. We are now, at long last, fully in the zone. This is when we find out that the zone is a small derelict village of some sort, overgrown, silent, and foggy. Later on we'll get hints of things that happened here, abandoned, hollowed-out tanks and decomposing corpses, but for now, Stalker gives some backstory about his predecessor, Porcupine, aka the Teacher, which means we're getting our first potential Christ figure, highlighted ever so gracefully by the leaning, cross-shaped powerline poles. In the Bible, Teacher is one of the most common honorifics given to Jesus, and we will eventually learn that this universe's teacher, Porcupine, eventually died for the room, though it was less from crucifixion and more from deciding to use a rope as a necktie. Stalker was his disciple, and after Porcupine's death, he began carrying the torch for new converts to the room. I'll elaborate more on that when we finally get there, but at this point, Stalker tells the others to stay at the tracks for a minute while he goes away into the grass just outside of the building containing the room to wallow happily in nature. So, right away, we get another possible way of looking at the film, as a reflection of the soulless decay of the last decades of the Soviet Union. The supposed glorious civilization promised by the Soviet Revolution, as pictured by Stalker's Spartan, depressing living conditions, is what has led his wife to her despair, while here, in a place where nature is reclaiming the world, Stalker finds the only happiness he will ever know. There's also a tiny little worm crawling on his hand that I always get distracted by, but I don't think that means anything. Meanwhile, Professor tells Ryder some of Stalker's personal background, that Stalker's daughter, Monkey, was born without legs because of the effects of Stalker spending so much time in the zone. And then Professor hints at where the zone came from, that it was thought to be a meteorite but was probably something else, something unknowable. If you're thinking this is another example of incomprehensibility like the sentient ocean from Solaris, stop, because I don't think the zone is meant to be a metaphor for the unknown. There are similarities when it comes to the subconscious phantoms created by Solaris, but for the most part, the zone is one of two things. Either it really is a magical gift, as Stalker claims, or it is nothing at all. Just a place that got abandoned after a battle or some other fully comprehensible tragedy. While the characters in the film itself lean heavily towards the metaphysical explanation, there is no concrete evidence either way. Still, belief is a powerful thing, and it underlies the real reasons why our characters never enter the room, because it will either grant their deepest desires and reveal their inner selves in the most devastating way, as it did to Porcupine, or it will do nothing at all, removing all mystery and hope from their lives. In other words, you may think you want a resolution to the puzzle of what the room is, but you really don't. That is the paradox of true desire, something Ryder hints at a little earlier in the film when he talks about how his conscious self might want to become a vegetarian, but his id wants only steak. I should probably point out that while making Stalker, Tarkovsky was deep in Zen Buddhism. So our heroes make their way towards the room, only Stalker tells them they cannot go in a direct line, that they have to follow short, tangential lines indicated by the throwing of a metal nut tied to a piece of cloth. When Ryder gets frustrated and decides to try going straight despite Stalker's warnings, he makes it halfway before hearing someone tell him to stop, at which point he turns back. We never know who actually said stop, whether it was Stalker, the room, or, as the professor theorizes, Ryder himself. So, with Stalker admonishing them to take things seriously from now on, we end Part 1. The topic of today's video was voted on by my Patreon supporters. If you'd like to vote on future topics, get ad-free versions of my videos, and see the occasional bonus video, consider joining my Patreon or becoming a channel member. I'd like to give a special shout out to my $8 androids: Batty Bat Firebrand, Chuck Poor, Diane McGill Davis, Don Quixote, Giffen Chumley DDF, Harold the Hatter, Jack Blair, John Burrell, Mike O'Connor, Robert McGill, Scott Johnner, Spoats, Tracy Rothmyers, and Warren Davis. Thank you all so much for your support. Take note of where the characters are at the start of Part 2, because you'll be seeing it again, replete with the nut and cloth hanging in the background. This might be a good time to explain that most of the movie was filmed in Tallinn, Estonia, in places like old power plants and a disused chemical factory. It is alleged, though it can't be definitively proven, that Andrei Tarkovsky, his wife Larissa, and star Anatoly Solzhenitsyn's respective deaths in the years that followed, all from the same type of lung cancer, happened as a result of this. Anyway, there's a shot of a stone falling into a well, followed by an inner monologue of Stalker quoting the Tao Te Ching when it discusses there being great strength in weakness, and he wishes that his companions, when they get to the room, will have faith, not just in it, but in themselves. This is key because it goes back to what I was saying about our greatest wishes revealing parts of ourselves we may not be ready to face, something writer will go to great lengths to explain later. What this has to do with the Tao Te Ching's point about softness being the embodiment of life will be a lot clearer when we get to the very last shot of the film. Next, Professor says he has to turn back to retrieve his rucksack, and for reasons that will also become clear later, he refuses to heed Stalker's warning about going back the way they came. So, with Professor gone and Stalker explaining that he is all but lost, Stalker and writer go on through what Stalker calls the dry tunnel, which is anything but. When they emerge on the other side, they find Professor right back where they started. And there is a lot of confusion over the timing and geometry of events, along with that hanging nut, all of which Stalker chalks up to the mysterious nature of the zone. The three of them then decide to have a lie down in the standing water, and we finally meet the dog. This dog, an Estonian sheepdog, was heard a little earlier when the trio first entered the zone, which they theorized might be proof of other people living there, something Stalker dismissed but might have been predicting his future desire to move his family next to the room. Part of me likes to think of it as a kind of time loop, where Stalker is hearing his future self and their new dog, or at the very least hearing another Stalker like himself, but I will say that the dog has always been the most perplexing element of the film for me. This dog befriends our heroes, and in the end, he follows them back out into the real world, and one of the theories I came across to explain what the dog represents is merely proof that everything that happens in the film really did happen, or that the dog has followed them out of the dream world and into reality. I've also heard the theory that the dog is another Christ figure, but no matter how hard I try to make that fit, it just doesn't. Not even with the quoted Bible passage about Jesus' appearance on the road to Emmaus, a quote that makes more sense if you say Stalker is the Christ figure, trying to lead two companions to a deeper faith. Regardless, we now get to one of my favorite of the writer's monologues, where he talks about going back to the world after being granted the power of a writing genius with endless inspiration. Since true art comes from suffering and longing, though, what kind of writer would he be? If he doesn't have to keep proving himself, what purpose would he have to write at all? In other words, if he gets what he wants, he will wind up with nothing. He sees art as a crutch for humanity's weakness, but if you take away that weakness, then there is no need for the crutch. Not only is this terribly insensitive talk around Stalker, whose daughter can't walk, but it also goes back to the Tao Te Ching quote. Again, we'll loop back on this at the end. What follows that monologue is a great and technically impressive tracking shot over the water, where we glimpse a series of seemingly random objects over a tile floor. There's another shot just like this later in the film, and that very same tile pattern appears in the room, which heavily implies that these are the objects and wishes people have left behind. Tarkovsky repeatedly said in life that water does not hold any symbolic meaning in his films, despite how frequently he uses it. But here, I like to think water represents the subconscious, though that metaphor doesn't always hold up. After they wake from their nap, the three men then enter a new tunnel that Stalker refers to as the Meat Grinder, a direct reference to the gulags of old. Stalker alleges that this is the most dangerous part of their journey, and he forces Ryder to lead the way through a rigged drawing of lots, perhaps a holdover from the earlier draft in which Stalker was a con artist. It's worth noting that Stalker always takes up the rear, never the front, because he is constantly trying to push them forward, hoping they will have what it takes to enter the room. In what appears to be a miracle, nothing much happens, as Ryder makes his way through the tunnel with Stalker and Professor behind him. I'll admit it, this part is probably the dullest stretch of the film for me, but I understand why it's here. After they finally get to the end, the trio enter the most visually striking and surreal area of the movie, a chamber filled with miniature dunes of sand. Ryder powers too far ahead, which causes the other two to panic, and then, from the lip of an extremely deep well, he delivers another monologue, this time speaking directly to the camera, to the audience. He talks about how creation is inherently depleting, that anything you make will be consumed, no, devoured, by the outside world, that when you pour your soul into art, your soul is taken away by others. In your longing for connection, you lose yourself. In his own words, writing is, quote, like extruding hemorrhoids, unquote. It's another variation on Ryder's cynical view of desire, which informs what is to come, and might just be a naked, damning expression of Tarkovsky's own experience. The trio reunites and enters the threshold to the room. Stalker reveals that Porcupine lost his brother here, which Ryder will later use to explain why the former Stalker took his own life. Because when Porcupine entered the room, all he got was riches, and he couldn't live with the fact that deep in his soul, he knew he valued money more than the life of his own brother. Another possible interpretation is that Porcupine's story isn't what we're told, that, and follow me with this, Stalker is actually Porcupine. Stalker's neck is always covered, so maybe he's hiding the scars from when he succumbed to his despair, and maybe he survived that with enough injuries that it has made him permanently sick and dependent on drugs, which exhausted his supposed riches. This pseudo-resurrection story leans into the Stalker as Christ figure idea, and makes it all the more obvious that he is the stand-in for Jesus in the Emmaus story. Food for thought. While Stalker and Ryder argue over the drawn lots from earlier, the most legitimately funny thing happens. A phone starts ringing. Ryder picks it up in frustration and tells the caller they have the wrong number, and then he hangs up. After a beat, the three of them then stare at the phone. Professor takes it at this point and calls one of his colleagues to tell him that he has finally reached the room and that he plans to do what he set out to do, something that only makes sense later, when Professor reveals that his plan is to use the bomb stashed in his rucksack to blow up the room, because it is too powerful a thing to let anyone get their hands on, that its very existence will lead to an army of Führers. He even posits that all the bad things happening in the world today are because of the room.
Oh, hi, Mark.
Now, if we assume the room is a metaphor for God himself, then Professor is arguing that too many ills in the world, war, famine, decay, are drawn from mankind's need to know God, that the power of faith combined with desire is far too great to be allowed to survive in the modern world. In other words, he wants to kill God, because men cannot allow themselves to be ruled by something so evil. Editing Tug back again, you could also say the room is like the noble intentions of socialism, which turn evil in the flawed hands of men and are responsible for creating the misery of the Soviet state. I didn't really want to talk about that because politics, but I need to at least bring it up here for completeness sake. Anyway, back to past Tug. Ryder denounces this thinking like he denounces everything, and to highlight it, he places a crown of thorns on his head, a clear mockery of Christ. while Stalker, who may or may not be the real Christ figure of our story, argues that no one can find happiness at the expense of others. I also want to quickly talk about a moment during all of this when Ryder flips a power switch, causing a light bulb to illuminate and then blow itself out. Something similar happens at the very start of the film when Stalker is confronted by his wife. This is probably a metaphor for desire. The brighter it burns, the more it leaves you empty. So, finally, the men do actually approach the room. It is here where everything reaches its climax. Ryder decides he cannot enter the room because nothing good can come from facing the vagaries of his own soul, and then Professor starts to assemble his bomb. At this revelation, Stalker breaks down, they struggle over the bomb, and he pleads with Professor and Ryder not to blow up the only hope left in an increasingly hopeless world, that the zone is the only thing left that brings happiness, freedom, and dignity on the other side of the barbed wire. This is where we must come to terms with what the zone actually is. Is it hope? Is it desire? Is it a window to the subconscious? Or is it God himself? For Tarkovsky, I think it represents all these things, that it represents art. He didn't actually consider film to be a true art form of its own, just an amalgamation of older modes. It has the visual meaning and beauty of painting and photography, the form and substance of architecture and design, the soaring emotional potential of music and sound, the profound insights and poetry of the written word, and the performance and spectacle of the theater. But in that synthesis that is film, Tarkovsky found a truth unlike any other, and that is what he is trying to highlight and protect with Stalker, the movie that, in the cruelest twist of fate, probably led to his death. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's how I read it. Professor realizes there is no danger in the room, that by its very nature, it will judge those who enter it and leave them broken. So, with the phone ringing away in the background, he dismantles his bomb and tosses its pieces inside, where only the camera enters, showing our trio of heroes as they sit at the room's threshold and water pours in from above. But the movie doesn't end here. We cut back to Stalker's wife, who after leaving Monkey on a bench, enters the bar to discover that the trio has returned, along with the dog. Then we get one of my favorite shots of the whole film, with the camera close up on Monkey, who it looks like is walking on her own accord. The camera slowly pulls back, though, to reveal that she's actually riding on her father's shoulders, that he is acting as her legs. It kind of reminds me of the footprints in the sand parable, but I don't think that's intentional. So, they go back home, where Stalker is despondent over the fact that no one has ever been able to make it into the room. And then his wife gives a monologue to the camera, expressing how she would rather live a life of interesting sorrow than one of ease and boredom. Finally, we get a shot of Monkey, sitting alone at a table and seemingly using telekinesis to move a few glasses before a train passes by. The telekinesis bit seems to come completely out of left field, but it makes sense with the Taoist themes Tarkovsky has been developing throughout the movie. She is the weakest character, reliant on crutches and completely non-verbal, but that's what also makes her the strongest. Maybe it is the zone that has given her this gift, or maybe it's a simple magic trick, but ultimately this little girl, with her frailty and sorrow, is a truer hope than that represented by the room. And that was Stalker. The movie released in May of 1979 and did relatively well in its home country, selling approximately 4.3 million tickets against its 1 million Soviet rubles. Critics at the time were lukewarm at best, but the film did gain traction over the years that followed. It is now considered one of the greatest films ever made, and certainly one of the best pieces of art to come out of the Soviet Union. And like I said before, it's on my personal top 5 list. So of course, I'm going to certify it as a sci-fi classic. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. Let me know if you like this new format, because I might use it again the next time I cover something this heady. Be sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons, and until next time, when we'll mix dinosaurs with cowboys, This is the Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love. As long as you're not hurting anybody.
Уберите это. А, понятно. Сухой закон. Алкоголизм – бич народов. Ну что ж, будем пить пиво.